Hello YouTube. So I wanted to do this. Someone sent me a video response about my video on MRAs, and I wanted to make a few statements about that video. First of all, the video that I did on MRAs, I did in 3 minutes because a thought struck me, and I just put on my camera on my phone and said some stuff and put it up for it. The goal was not to undermine anything. It wasn't to undermine the MRA cause or whatever you like. But I will say that it definitely was misread also. I'm not trying to trivialize the issues that are approached. I think that there are political issues to do with gender, period, for men and women. First of all, I don't think there's any particular reason to, I don't want to use the word privilege because everybody's going to misread that word. There's no particular reason to prioritize or to highlight men's issues if you conceive of gender or issues about gender in the broad scope, right? So this is another just sort of off the cuff critique, is that if you're conceiving of the politics of gender and the relation of power to gender, and if you feel that feminism, which is the space where that's sort of traditionally done, has shortchanged men in one way or another, then it seems to me that the label that should be adopted is gender rights activist, not men's rights activist. It seems almost petty to just say gender rights activist, or to say men's rights activist. Excuse me. Now, feminism, on the other hand, has a history, right? It has a history that we don't tend to talk about. There's a reason why there's a whole host of reasons why the word feminism came up. Now, if I had to choose, I wouldn't advocate the use of any particular gender label as a rallying point, right? But I think that there are historical reasons and spatial reasons to be more sympathetic to the term feminism than there is for the term men's rights activist. Now, one thing that I want to highlight here, and it's going to lead into my I don't want to say it's a critique, but I want to say it's what I would an instability that I would mark in the video response that I got. The issue that I want to highlight is that if you read texts about women, right, from the 19th century and into the early 20th century, there's actually a somewhat interesting notion, interesting in its horrific sexism at least, that women do not exist, right? That's not to say that there isn't some biological creature, but rather everything that is womanly is merely a negation of that which is manly, right? So that which is manly is to be strong, so therefore women are not strong. To be manly is to be smart, so women are not smart. To be etc., etc. So woman as such has no ontology, right? There is no identity to woman. Woman is just kind of the excremental leftover, or the surplus of the identity of men, right? Um, and that was an idea that men talked about, right? That's not some feminist revisionist history. And you could find echoes of it even into Lacan, but I don't want to get into that conversation. So, someone who apparently has a lot of I'm not sure if he would identify as an MRA, but someone who seemingly has his sympathies with the MRAs, posted a video response and talked about a number of different sort of interesting things and statistics and stuff. First of all, he seemed to think that my video was about the issues that the MRA addresses. And it's not. Again, it was a very off-the-cuff video, but what I was getting at was that to rally around the signifier men's rights activist, to rally around that label, is the problem, right? So, what I would say, or I suppose by question, let's say, my question is essentially just, when you say you're a men's rights activist, or when you say that this is a men's issue, what do you mean by the word man or men, right? What are you signifying with that signifier? On the one hand, there's the biological aspect, right? Of course. There is, to have a certain set of genitalia is entailed in being a man, kind of. If a man is castrated or otherwise loses his genitals, perhaps in some terrible gardening accident, is he still a man? Well, I mean, I think most of us would probably say yes, right? Okay, so then what about if it's someone has proposed, well, it's at the level of chromosomes, right? Well, what about a transgendered person who undergoes sexual reassignment surgery? They still have the chromosomes of a man, but they may become female-bodied, right? So think about Zinnia Jones, for instance. I don't mean to call out a particular person, but is Zinnia Jones a man when you use the signifier man? Does she fall into this category? It seems like there's a lot of gray area, and it seems like it's not quite sufficient to say that man is a biologically or a solely biologically constituted category, right? Clearly there's some cultural dimension, right? And this is the other side of this signifier, man, right? So some things are manly, right? Or we describe them as manly. Maybe sports, or I don't know, cars, or the thing, just to pick cliches, right? There's this sort of cliche, and in fact I would say probably demeaning to men, ideal gender norm of what it is to be a man. So this is a different sense in which the term man operates. Right, so you have these two layers. You have the biological and you have the cultural, and these categories or these layers aren't necessarily well delineated or well defined. But this becomes terrifically important when you want to identify a men's rights issue. So if you talk about men raping women to, as you did in, I think you touched on South Africa, um, but I'm sure it happens in other places. If you talk about men raping women to correct lesbianism, that's clearly a women's issue, right, and a horrific women's issue. Um, if you talk about, on the other hand, the rape of a gay man to correct their homosexuality, um, uh, things become a little bit more curious. And I don't, of course, there's a symmetry in rape is rape, and rape is always horrible, regardless of what gender you're a part of or you identify with. No one contests this, I don't think. Um, but there's a history, a long-standing history of men, and not just men, right? Like, we see this to do with nation states, right? This notion that if you're German, you're not behaving like a German. So therefore there needs to be some normative, violent correction to make you a German, right? Or something like that, right? Because your non-Germanness is destabilizing or subversive to the idea of being a German, right? We see this, in some way. This is kind of similar to, we see this in McCarthyism, right? You are undermining our national identity in the Cold War, and we will bring you to these criminal prosecutions and all of this, right? This seems to be one of the foundational qualities of establishing identity, right? Is to recognize, to exclude a category, and then to commit some kind of violence in order to distinguish oneself from that category. So if homosexuality is conceived to be not manly, or to be in some way threatening to that which it is to be a man, that is to say, it's threatening to the family structure or something like that, then it seems plausible to suggest that the rape, right, or the coerced sex correction of homosexual men, well, obviously it's a men's issue, and obviously it's horrific, but power there, the power relation is qualitatively different, right? So on the one hand, of course, men are the victim. On the other hand, men are the perpetrator, and so you can't really quite conceive of this as a gender issue in the same way as raping women or something. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But this is what I'm trying to get at when I say that. Are you talking about culturally, what is it to be a man, or are you talking about biologically, what is it to be a man? Because it seems to me that those kinds of behaviors are in place to reinforce a certain notion of manhood, a certain notion of manliness, right? So, if we take another example, the photographs taken at Abu Ghraib, for instance, there were Iraqi men put into a situation of forced fellatio and rape, right? Now, this is clearly a men's issue, but at the same time, it's also clearly, I'm going to use this word, I'm going to hazard this word, it's clearly patriarchal in a certain sense, right? So I'm not necessarily talking about some overarching notion of patriarchy, but that gesture has a dimension of patriarchy. There's a gendered violence of man asserting dominance, sexual dominance, over man, right? Which is also patriarchal. So these issues start to become really complex. And I would say that over the past 50 years, um, with the rise of homosexuality, we have seen a destabilization or a broadening of the category of what is manly, right? And that's okay. That happens, right? As cultures change, these sort of roles change. Um, but if you want to do any serious analysis of gender and power, and I would criticize feminists for this too, or at least a particular kind of feminist for this too, the ones who you seem to, or people seem to be saying that somewhat conspiratorially, that they push evidence of men being abused under the rug or something like that. Um, if you want, if you want to say, do some form of the analysis of gender and power, you need to begin by making these fundamental distinctions, right? Is the biology of a man that which constitutes manhood? I don't think it's sufficient to say it is. So then, what is this cultural category of manhood? Precisely how does that operate, and precisely how does that move in society? See, these are the questions that you're just not asking, right? This question of the relationship between our biology and that which, by virtue of simply being produced with this biology, that we're supposed to be, those sides of the coin, you need to make these theoretical distinctions before you can kind of give any critique of gendered power whatsoever. So yeah, that's, I think, one other thing that I want to talk about. Evolutionary psychology. This seems to be a huge fallback for the MRAs who have been hopping onto my video, and welcome, by the way. Please subscribe. This seems to be a huge sticking point, right? This notion that various behaviors and various social roles arise due to our evolution. Various things like objectification, for instance, may have some evolutionary basis. And what follows then is what I don't buy, right? What follows then is this statement, therefore it's justified, right? That leap seems to me to be impossible. And if I can illustrate a parallel case, I could imagine, and I don't know if this is true or not, but just as a thought experiment, it seems like it probably might be true though. I could imagine in our evolutionary history, it might be the case that we were conditioned to fear the tribe on the other side of the lake. That is to say, to have colder or more distant or an ambivalence, right, to others, to other groups who we're not related to and we're not, conditioned to be around, and whatever you like, right? And I feel like on this basis alone, perhaps other bases as well, you could do an entire account of the evolutionary history of racism and xenophobia. Now, would you possibly use those grounds to justify racism and xenophobia? This is what I'm saying. You might be able to say on those grounds something like, I've heard racist people say, well, we're all a little bit racist. And you know what? Maybe there's some kind of inkling of evolutionary truth to that. But at the same time, the problem comes in when you say, and that's okay, or that's good in some way, or that's justified. No, I'm sorry, it's not. Your evolutionary conditioning is not an excuse to take on certain attitudes. And it's not justification for anything. So I just want to make that quick point that our evolutionary psychology does not justify our social relations and the forms they take. It might explain them, but it doesn't justify them. So yeah, I think that pretty much covered everything that I want to cover for the moment. I have a lot more thoughts on this, and I guess I'll unravel them as people comment, and maybe I'll get another video response. But for the time being, have a good night.